2 security guards dragged Ethan Rowe off the sideline, while 60,000 voices shook the upper decks of Kingsley Field. His old credential badge was snatched away and crushed underfoot, as head coach Wade Callahan announced to anyone who would listen that the man being hauled toward the tunnel was an intruder. Ethan did not fight back. He looked toward the scoreboard, where the Monarchs were about to run a formation he knew would expose their quarterback to a blindside hit he would not see coming. The tunnel door began to swing shut. High above the field, behind the glass of the owner's suite, Evelyn Kingsley rose from her chair and stared at the man being dragged away. She recognized him. If you believe loyalty is worth more than reputation, stay with the secret Ethan carried for 11 years. The morning had started the way every morning started for Ethan Rowe. Quietly, without ceremony, inside a life that bore no outward evidence of the career it had replaced. He was 42 years old, a field technician for an electronics contracting company out of suburban Boston, and he had spent the first 3 hours of that particular Friday replacing corroded junction boards inside a mid-sized warehouse off Route 9. His truck was a 12-year-old pickup with a cracked dashboard and a coffee thermos wedged between the seats. His hands were calloused in a way that had nothing to do with weight rooms or pregame rituals. The single photograph on his dashboard showed a 17-year-old girl with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. His daughter, Marin, who knew her father had once worked for the Boston Monarchs and had left because of a professional mistake, and who had never pressed him for the details because she had learned, young and instinctively, that some of her father's silences were the kind that held weight rather than emptiness. He was wrapping the warehouse job when the encrypted message arrived through a secondary channel he had not used in nearly 2 years. The sender was listed only as a string of digits, but the authentication signature belonged to a man named Silas Boone, who had managed the Monarchs' equipment for 33 years, and who was one of perhaps 4 people on the planet who still knew how to reach Ethan through that route. The message was short. Crown Key had been reactivated. Someone was running it live inside the Monarchs' communication system, and the quarterback, a 28-year-old named Nolan Pierce, was receiving intercepted signals through his helmet relay without knowing it. Attached to the message were 3 photographs of a signal routing board that had been physically modified, its internal architecture rerouted in a way that was nearly invisible unless you had written the original schematic yourself, which Ethan had, in a windowless office 11 years ago at the request of a man who was now dead. He sat in the front seat of his truck for several minutes with the engine off, the photographs open on his phone, and the particular quality of stillness around him that comes not from peace, but from a man forcing himself to think before he acts. Everything in Ethan's rebuilt life argued for putting the phone away, driving back to his apartment, and making dinner for Marin when she got home from school. He had paid an enormous price to reach this level of ordinary. He had given up a profession, a reputation, a city, a sense of himself as a person whose work mattered to anyone beyond the customer on the next work order. The Monarchs had taken all of that from him, or more precisely, a man inside the Monarchs had taken it, and the organization had allowed the theft to stand because allowing it was more convenient than the alternative. Walking back into Kingsley Field was not a decision that could be unmade once it was made. He knew that with the clarity of someone who had already made an enormous and irreversible decision once before, and who still lived inside its consequences every single day. What changed his mind was not nostalgia or anger or wounded pride. What changed his mind was the 3rd photograph, which showed the signal board modification aimed specifically at disrupting the protection schemes assigned to Nolan Pierce's blind side. Ethan had spent 3 evenings earlier that week watching film of the Monarchs' last 3 losses, and in each one, the breakdowns that cost them, the coverage busts, the missed protections, The plays where Nolan barely escaped getting injured followed the same timing pattern. The defensive adjustments came within a window of less than 2 seconds after the offensive signal was transmitted, which was physiologically impossible without external information. Someone was reading the Monarch's plays before the snap, and whoever was doing it had constructed the pattern of exposure to target Nolan Pierce specifically, not the offense in general, which meant the goal was not simply to lose games but to force the quarterback out of the lineup, manufacture a crisis, and do something with the chaos that followed. Ethan put the truck in gear, called Marin to tell her he would be late, listened to her voice for 30 seconds longer than the message required, and then drove toward Boston. Silas had left the contractor credential at a service entrance on the stadium's north side, along with instructions to reach equipment room 14 before kickoff. When Ethan arrived, the room was empty and the credential had been partially deactivated. It would pass the outer scanner but not the inner zone access. Someone had discovered the arrangement. The internal security flag on the card's activity log confirmed it. A notification had been triggered, and the notification was routed automatically to the office of Grant Halbrook, the Monarch's chief executive officer, who had been the organization's head of data security 11 years ago when everything fell apart. Ethan stood in that narrow corridor and understood with complete clarity that he had already been identified, that whatever happened next would happen on ground that someone else had prepared, and that he had come too far to leave before Nolan Pierce ran a play that could end the young man's season before Christmas. He was standing at the edge of the field when Wade Callahan spotted the name on the credential badge, and the night came apart from there. The security room where they brought Ethan was on the stadium's second level, a windowless space with monitors showing every camera angle on the property, and it smelled of recycled air and old carpet. Grant Halbrook stood near the door with his jacket buttoned and his expression composed in the particular way of a man who has rehearsed composure so often it has become indistinguishable from the real thing. He was 54 years old, silver-haired, the kind of polished that comes from 3 decades of navigating boardrooms and press conferences and situations where the person with the most controlled face wins. He spoke quietly about trespassing statutes and falsified credentials, and the unfortunate pattern of a former employee who seemed unwilling to accept the consequences of his own misconduct. Ethan stood with his wrists zip-tied in front of him and said nothing, because he had spent 11 years learning which rooms required patience instead of words. Evelyn Kingsley entered without knocking, and the quality of the air in the room changed the moment she stepped through the door. She was 47, lean and self-possessed in the way of someone who had been trained from birth to occupy important spaces without apologizing for it. She had inherited the Monarchs from her father, Harrison Kingsley, 4 years earlier, along with the weight of a franchise that carried his name on its stadium and his philosophy in its organizational culture. She looked at Ethan Rowe with an expression that was not surprise, because she had been looking for him for years, and the surprise had long since faded into something closer to grim resolution. She spoke his full name clearly and without hesitation, as if she had said it many times before in rooms where he was not present. She told the security personnel to remove the restraints and then told everyone except Ethan and Grant to leave. Ethan watched her across the room and placed the memory that had been circling since he first saw her face on the security monitor. She had been seated at the far end of a conference table 11 years ago, young and barely visible in a room full of older men, present for a closed-door inquiry that had ended his career before dinner was served. She had not spoken during that proceeding. He had not been able to tell at the time whether her silence was indifference or something else. Grant recited the formal record with smooth efficiency, the charges of data theft, playbook distribution, signal interference, the investigative findings that had led to Ethan's permanent suspension from the league. Ethan interrupted him by asking a single question. Had they already called Crown left in the third quarter? On the monitors, the offense was lining up. The formation went into motion. Sentinels shifted into an overload blitz from the side the signal compromise had left unguarded, and Nolan Pierce lost the football and 15 yards of field position in under 4 seconds. Evelyn turned from the screen to Ethan. The room was quiet with the specific quality of silence that follows an accurate prediction. She reached into the interior pocket of her jacket and produced a single folded sheet of paper, a photocopy of a handwritten note, and offered it to him with only one line visible. If Crown Key appears again, find Ethan before you trust anyone else. Ethan looked at the paper for a long moment without taking it. He said that the letter had arrived too late to give him back 11 years. He said it without bitterness, in the tone of a man stating a fact he has fully processed, and the evenness of his voice seemed to settle Evelyn more than anger would have. She acknowledged that she had searched for him after her father's death, that every address and contact record attached to his name had been altered or erased, and that the trail had gone cold within months of her beginning to follow it. Grant observed that a man who did not want to be found had presumably taken steps to ensure he would not be. Ethan turned and looked at him directly for the first time since entering the room, and said that the only person in this building with the executive access level required to systematically erase an employee's contact history from every league-affiliated database was the person who had managed data security during the period in question. Grant's composure held, but something behind his eyes shifted slightly, the way a poker player's expression shifts when the board turns against him and he has not yet decided whether to fold. The 30 minutes Evelyn granted Ethan were not a gift. They were a test that she was conducting on herself as much as on him, because she needed to know before morning whether her father's letter represented a dying man's genuine guilt or a dying man's revisionist self-protection. She arranged for Ethan to be escorted to the analytics suite, where a technician and 2 members of the coaching staff were already pulling up signal logs, and where Wade Callahan waited, with his arms crossed in the body language of a man who has been asked to sit down to dinner with someone he considers responsible for the worst period of his professional life. Wade was 49 and had built his entire identity around a standard of competitive integrity that he applied to others with far less mercy than he applied to himself. He believed in the record. The record said Ethan Rowe had betrayed the Monarchs. He intended to make clear that whatever the owner's personal curiosity required, he would not pretend that history did not exist. Ethan did not address Wade's hostility. He asked to see the raw signal data from the 3 most recent losses, specifically the transmission logs for the 40-second window before each compromised snap. The technician pulled the files. What Ethan showed them was not complicated to understand once you knew what to look for. Embedded inside each legitimate tactical signal was a secondary data packet, small enough to pass undetected by the current monitoring software, structured in a format that had not been used in any active system for more than a decade. It was a recovery handshake, a fail-safe protocol that Ethan had built into Crown Key to allow the system to re-establish communication if the primary channel was disrupted during a game. It was a piece of architecture so obscure that it had never been formally documented outside of a single internal report filed with Harrison Kingsley and reviewed by his head of data security, who at that time had been Grant Hallbrook. 3 people had ever known the protocol existed. One of them was dead. One of them was standing in the room. Ethan let that arithmetic settle over the group without narrating it. Grant argued that Ethan was using old proprietary knowledge to fabricate evidence of interference, that a man with his technical background could plausibly construct exactly this kind of manufactured trail. Nolan Pierce, who had been leaning against the far wall in silence, pushed off the wall and asked Ethan why whoever was stealing the signals kept targeting the protection scheme specifically assigned to his blind side. Ethan explained that the pattern had a strategic logic separate from the game results. If Nolan went down injured or played badly enough to be benched, the team's win total collapsed, the franchise valuation dropped, and an emergency governance review could be triggered if the on-field crisis was paired with a simultaneous data security scandal. Evelyn went still. There was a board vote scheduled for the following morning. A scenario in which the team lost and a data theft became public in the same 12-hour window would give the minority ownership coalition, which had been pushing to restructure executive authority for 2 years, sufficient grounds to request a temporary suspension of her operational control. The person designated to serve as interim executive pending that review was the chief executive officer, whose name was Grant Hallbrook. Ethan suggested they test the system with a fabricated play call and see how the opposing defense responded. Wade sat down. The fabricated call went in. Sentinels shifted before the Monarchs broke their huddle. While the analytics room processed what that meant, Silas Boone found his way through a service corridor to the suite level, his old credentials finally exhausted, but his knowledge of the building's secondary passages undiminished by 3 decades of use. He was 63, built wide and low, with the deliberate movement of a man who had learned long ago that urgency and haste were different things. He told Ethan that someone had locked him out of the equipment level after he sent the message that morning, and that he had spent the hours since working his way back in through a stairwell that had not been on the official building map since a renovation 12 years ago. He also told him that the original signal logs from the night of the incident 11 years ago, the night that had ended Ethan's career and, Silas believed, had always been the work of someone other than the man who bore the consequences, were sitting on a standalone storage drive in a basement archive room below the north stands, in a system that had never been connected to the main network, and had therefore escaped every subsequent data purge that Grant had ordered over the years. Grant had begun moving quickly in the minutes after Nolan's question landed in the analytics room. Evelyn noticed it before anyone else did, the quiet efficiency of a man closing accounts. He had excused himself briefly to make a phone call, and when the network administrator attempted to run a permissions audit on the tactical database, the master login credentials had already been changed. Ethan examined the timing and architecture of the change and recognized the signature. It matched the modification pattern on the helmet relay board in Silas's photographs. It matched the secondary data packet embedded in the compromised signals. It matched, in its underlying logic and its specific technical vocabulary, the structure of the crown key vulnerability that Ethan had identified in the field during the third quarter, the 0.8-second delay caused by legacy hardware that had no place in a current system unless someone had deliberately kept it there. The math was not ambiguous. Evelyn looked at the ceiling for a moment, breathed out, and told Ethan that if the archive room had what Silas believed it had, she needed to see it before Grant reached the basement. The media had already begun circulating the image of Ethan being dragged off the field, with a caption that named him by his 11-year-old reputation and suggested his reappearance at Kingsley Field was the beginning of another act of sabotage. The image had spread through every sports news outlet in the building within 20 minutes of the incident. Evelyn saw it on 3 different screens as they moved through the corridor, and she saw the same reflexive contempt already running in the coverage headlines. People who knew one fact and had built a verdict from it. Ethan looked at the screens once and looked away. He had lived inside other people's verdicts long enough to stop counting the days. Nolan Pierce appeared in the doorway of the analytics suite as they were preparing to leave and set his helmet down on the table in front of Ethan. He said he did not care what anyone in the building was calling Ethan. He said he needed to know how to survive the second half. Evelyn authorized Ethan's temporary credentialing as a technical security consultant before they descended to the basement, using owner's discretion in a way that would draw a legal challenge in the morning, but which was unambiguous in its authority tonight. The play-calling adjustment Ethan proposed was structural rather than cosmetic. Instead of transmitting full formation names, Nolan and the offensive coordinator would use a rotating reference system built on defensive reads that Ethan and Nolan constructed verbally in under 8 minutes, using a shared visual vocabulary they developed on the spot. Wade Callahan stood in the doorway during this process with the expression of a man watching his authority redistributed and finding he lacked the argument to stop it. He did not lack the capability to make good decisions. He lacked, in this moment, the willingness to put his pride down long enough to see that one of those good decisions was to trust the person in front of him. The first drive under the new system worked because sentinels could not intercept what was never transmitted through the compromised channel. Nolan changed his protection call at the line based on what he actually saw, not what had been signaled, and completed a 31-yard gain down the right side of the field that the opposing defense had completely abandoned in anticipation of an attack on the left. The crowd did not know what had changed. They saw a quarterback finding daylight and roared accordingly. Ethan watched from a position technically outside the coaching box, close enough to communicate, but careful not to give Grant anything formal to use against Evelyn's authorization. He was not thinking about the noise, or the scoreboard, or what the moment meant to any narrative about his own life. He was watching Nolan's movement after the play. The way the young man set his feet, confirmed his own safety, and looked back toward the sideline. That was what Ethan had come here to protect. Not a win percentage, not a playoff seeding. A 28-year-old athlete who deserved to know that the system around him was working honestly. In the owner's suite 2 levels above, Grant Hallbrook had recognized that the situational momentum had shifted against him and had begun executing the contingency he had prepared for exactly this scenario. He sent a data package to 3 separate sports media contacts containing Ethan's league suspension records, the formal investigative findings from 11 years ago, and a narrative framing Ethan's presence at the stadium as an act of deliberate interference by a disgruntled former employee. He sent a separate message to 2 members of the Monarchs' minority ownership group alerting them to a potential security breach and requesting an emergency governance review for the following morning. Then he queued a remote deletion command targeting the legacy archive server below the north stands. But the deletion required a physical network connection that the basement system did not have, which meant he needed someone with building access to complete it in person. The door to the basement archive room had been rekeyed within the last 48 hours. The basement corridor was narrow and warm, with the particular acoustics of a space that was never designed to carry sound but carries it anyway. Crowd noise filtering down through the concrete above them like the building itself was breathing. Ethan, Evelyn, and Silas moved through it without speaking more than necessary. The lock on the archive room door was new, its hardware inconsistent with everything around it, installed by someone who did not have access to the standard building maintenance ledger and had therefore not disguised the replacement. Ethan looked at it for a moment. Then he reached behind the door frame, found the secondary circuit panel he had installed himself as part of Crown Key's physical infrastructure, and entered the emergency reset sequence from memory. The door opened. The room inside was exactly as Silas had described it. Rows of archive shelves, most of the drive bays empty, several racks partially stripped. But Silas crossed to the far corner and found what he had hidden years before, behind a vintage radio equipment case that had not been moved in a decade. A single backup drive, small and undistinguished, labeled with a date that was 11 years in the past. The drive contained two files that mattered. The first was a recorded conversation between Harrison Kingsley and Ethan Rowe, captured in Harrison's office 6 hours before the formal inquiry, in which Harrison acknowledged that the leaked data had not originated from Ethan's account, but from a higher access node, that the technical evidence had been arranged rather than discovered, and that he was asking Ethan to accept interim responsibility until after the championship game so that the investigation could continue without disrupting the season. Harrison's voice in the recording carried the specific exhaustion of a man who has already done the thing he knows is wrong and is explaining rather than asking. Ethan's voice in the recording was quiet and agreed. He had been 31 years old, 3 months from becoming a widower, and wholly trusting of a man who presented himself as a person worth trusting. The second file was a system access log from the night of the incident, showing a Crown key credential entry at 11:47 in the evening from an executive-level account assigned to Grant Hallbrook, accessing the exact transmission pathway through which the data had been externally routed. Evelyn listened to her father's voice, finish speaking, and stared at the drive in her hands for a long time. She did not weep. She was not built for visible grief, or perhaps she had already done that grief alone, in the months after Harrison died, when she had found the sealed letter and begun to understand the shape of what it described. She said quietly that her father had not invented the scheme, but that he had let it become permanent through inaction and self-protection, and that the distinction, while real, was not a defense. Ethan said he had not come here to destroy her family's name. He had come because someone was going to do to Nolan Pierce exactly what had been done to him, and Nolan Pierce had not yet done anything that deserved what was coming. The building's emergency power relay switched off on the main corridor circuit. Grant's voice came through the internal communication system, level and reasonable, offering Evelyn a final arrangement. Hand over the drive. Allow the archived data to be classified under League confidentiality protocols, and avoid the public revelation that her father had coerced an innocent employee into accepting criminal liability. He framed it as protecting Harrison's legacy. He framed it as protecting the franchise. He framed it as sparing her the particular cruelty of being the person who destroyed what her father had built. Evelyn looked at the drive. She looked at Ethan. She said that a legacy requiring an innocent person to carry its guilt was not a legacy worth protecting. She said it without drama, in the tone of a woman who has worked out an argument over time and is finally delivering the conclusion to someone who needs to hear it. The data reached Adrian Cross through an encrypted channel on his personal device before Grant had fully processed Evelyn's refusal. Adrian was the League's senior investigator, the same man who had signed Ethan's suspension 11 years ago, based on a file that he now understood had been engineered, and he was sitting in the stadium's press level because he had been dispatched to investigate the current season's anomalous loss patterns. He had been building the same picture from the outside that Ethan had been building from memory, and when the archive files arrived, the technical signatures aligned with his independent findings in a way that could not be manufactured retroactively. He confirmed the match within 4 minutes and immediately froze Grant Hallbrook's system access across every platform. The signal device was located in Grant's private workstation suite during a physical search that Adrian authorized simultaneously, the 0.8-second delay hardware sitting in plain view on a shelf beside a standard router, unassuming in the way of objects that have never needed to hide because the person responsible for finding them was the person who placed them there. Wade Callahan was informed of the evidence in the corridor outside the analytics suite delivered concisely by a league security officer who had worked under Adrian for 6 years and did not soften facts on behalf of anyone's institutional dignity. Wade absorbed the information the way large men sometimes absorb news that requires structural revision, slowly, with a stillness that looked like stonewalling but was actually something closer to a foundation cracking and resettling. He had believed the file on Ethan Rowe because the file had been presented to him by the organization he trusted above his own instincts, and he had used that belief as permission to treat a man as guilty for a decade. He found Ethan near the tunnel entrance and said what needed to be said without excessive elaboration or self-extenuation. Ethan told him the accounting could wait because the Monarchs were down by 5 points with under 3 minutes on the clock, and Grant had inserted a compromised play call into the digital board before his access was terminated. Crown Left was sitting inside the 4th down call sequence, clean and invisible against the legitimate play options surrounding it. Ethan saw it in the personnel grouping and formation flag and understood immediately what it was designed to do. Sentinels had been holding their overload blitz package in reserve for exactly this formation, which meant the moment Nolan lined up under center with Crown Left as the call, 6 rushers would collapse from the blind side before the snap count reached 2. Ethan moved toward the sideline with the specific, unhurried speed of a man who has learned that panic costs more than it buys. The security detail that had been assigned to him earlier in the evening had not received the updated clearance order, and 2 of them stepped into his path at the painted line with the blank professional certainty of people following the last instruction they had been given. Ethan stopped. The clock moved 40 seconds. Evelyn Kingsley came through the tunnel access door onto the field level and walked directly to the boundary of the playing surface, which was a place she had every legal and organizational right to stand as the franchise owner. She told the security detail to stand down. She said it once clearly, at a register that carried authority rather than volume. The 2 guards stepped aside. Ethan crossed the line and reached the ball call station in time to see Wade already on the radio with Nolan, describing the exact play that was loaded in the system. Ethan took the headset from the coordinator's assistant without asking for it and told Nolan the call was poisoned, not to call Crown Left under any circumstances, and then gave him 3 seconds of instruction so clean and compact that Nolan repeated it back before Ethan had finished speaking. There was no new play installed. There was no elaborate audible system. What Ethan gave Nolan was a red key. Show Crown Left's formation in the first 2 seconds of the snap count, let Sentinels commit their blitz to the left side overload, then shift the snap count cadence 1 beat early, and release the 2 wide receivers into the coverage vacuum on the right side that the blitz would create. It was not a trick. It was the logical application of something Nolan already knew, that a defense reading stolen signals would overcommit to the predicted attack, combined with a quarterback's trust in the person giving him the information. Wade was silent on the sideline. He did not countermand the instruction. Nolan walked back to the huddle. Sentinels loaded the blitz exactly as Ethan had predicted. The snap came a beat ahead of the expected rhythm. The left side rush collapsed on empty space. The 2 receivers found the coverage hole before the defensive backs could rotate, and Nolan delivered the ball to the secondary receiver who had drifted 12 yards behind the broken coverage and caught it in full stride with nothing between him and the end zone. The stadium sound was immediate and enormous. The kind of collective noise that comes from 60,000 people processing the same thing at the same moment, which is that the game has changed in a direction they had stopped believing was possible. Ethan watched the play complete. He watched Nolan land cleanly after the throw, confirmed the young man was on his feet and unhurt, and then he exhaled. Not in celebration, in the specific, functional relief of a man who came here to prevent one outcome and has succeeded in preventing it. Nolan Pierce jogged to the sideline after the extra point, bypassed the offensive coordinator and the assistant coaches, and placed the game ball in Ethan Rowe's hands in front of the entire sideline and every camera trained on the Monarchs' bench. The formal proceedings moved with the institutional efficiency that follows the removal of obstruction. Adrian Cross and the league security team placed Grant Hallbrook into a witness-held status before the final whistle sounded, escorting him from the building without public incident, his access to every league and franchise system already revoked. Silas Boone delivered the backup drive and his own written documentation of the helmet equipment modifications through the chain of custody Adrian established, and the two files from the archive were authenticated against their metadata timestamps before midnight. The financial records that Adrian had been independently assembling showed a pattern of transactions routed through holding entities connected to Grant's personal legal counsel, timed to coincide with specific Monarchs losses, amounts consistent with what could be earned selling advance play call intelligence to a high-volume gambling operation that had been under federal scrutiny for 14 months. Wade Callahan requested a conversation with Ethan in the equipment room after the team had cleared the locker room. He was the kind of man whose apologies cost him something real, which made them worth accepting, and Ethan accepted it without adding to its weight. Wade said he should have questioned the file 11 years ago because the charges had never fully fit the person he had actually seen in the building. Ethan said that doubt was easier to suppress when the organization was organized around suppressing it. There was nothing conciliatory in either man's tone, and nothing hostile either. It was the conversation of two adults who had been positioned against each other by someone who benefited from that positioning, and who were now disassembling the structure that had made it possible. Evelyn addressed the assembled media in the post-game conference room with the kind of prepared candor that comes from having rehearsed an honest version of a difficult story rather than a managed one. She described the archive recording. She described what her father had asked of Ethan Rowe, and what Ethan had agreed to and what that agreement had cost him. She named Grant Hallbrook's role in both the original scheme and the current one, with the specificity that Adrian had approved for public release. She said that the Boston Monarchs, under her ownership, were acknowledging that an employee had been wrongfully suspended, wrongfully publicly accused, and wrongfully erased from the organization's history as a consequence of misconduct by people this organization had trusted and failed to adequately supervise. She said the word wrongfully 3 times in the same sentence without softening it. A reporter near the back asked why Ethan Rowe had not fought the original charges publicly. Ethan answered the question himself from the edge of the room, speaking in the direct, unhurried way of a man addressing something he has answered privately many times and is now saying aloud for the first time. He said that when the charges were filed, he was 31 years old, recently widowed, without significant savings, with a 3-year-old daughter, and facing a legal process that was funded by one of the wealthiest sports organizations in the country. He said that he had not left quietly because he was guilty. He had left quietly because continuing to fight would have required him to direct resources toward a courtroom instead of toward his daughter, and that when those were the only 2 options available, the choice was not ambiguous. The room was quiet in the way that rooms sometimes go quiet when a person has said a true thing that reorients the larger picture. Evelyn looked at him from across the room with an expression that contained something adjacent to grief, not for herself, but for the architecture of a situation that had made a 31-year-old father's love for his child into a structural advantage for a man running a fraud. Adrian announced that the league would reopen the formal record, that all professional restrictions attached to Ethan's name would be suspended pending full review, and that the review would be expedited given the nature of the new evidence. Evelyn offered, on behalf of Kingsley Sports Group, the full restoration of Ethan's compensation record, his professional standing in league-affiliated documentation, and a formal public correction of the investigative finding. Ethan accepted the professional restoration without elaboration. He declined to allow the circumstances to be converted into a marketing event for the franchise. He said that clearly and without rancor, and Evelyn acknowledged it as a legitimate condition. She asked, before the room cleared, what he needed to return to the Monarchs. He said he needed it to be a place where the person who tells the truth does not get pulled off the field. Several months later, Grant Hallbrook was formally indicted on 4 counts, including sports data fraud, conspiracy to manipulate athletic competition outcomes, and obstruction of a professional sports investigation. His counsel entered a not guilty plea, and the trial was set for the following spring. The 2 holding entities connected to his gambling operation were named in a parallel federal proceeding. The minority ownership coalition that had been positioned to benefit from an emergency governance review quietly withdrew their petition for executive restructuring before the end of the business week. Evelyn rebuilt the executive structure around 2 principles that Ethan had outlined in a written document he submitted before accepting any formal role: that player safety and data integrity reporting would flow directly to the owner and to the league's oversight body simultaneously, bypassing executive management entirely, and that the department responsible for this function would be staffed and evaluated independently of the team's competitive performance. She created the position she had in mind for him with the title Director of Strategic Integrity, and she created it with the reporting structure he had specified. Ethan accepted it. He told Marin that evening in terms that were more precise than he had been before, not the full architecture of what had happened 11 years ago, because some of that would come in time, but enough so that she understood the outline of what her father had carried and why he had carried it the way he did. She listened without interrupting, which was how she had always listened to important things, with her mother's quality of attention in her father's daughter's face. Wade Callahan remained the head coach and grew, across the following months, into something closer to the coach he had claimed to be all along, a man who listened before he deployed authority, who invited rather than commandeered the expertise of the people around him. He and Ethan did not become close in the way that resolved conflict sometimes manufactures closeness. They became something more durable. 2 professionals who had been manipulated into opposing positions, who now understood the mechanism that had placed them there, and who chose to be useful to each other instead of defined by what had been done to them. Nolan Pierce called Ethan on the morning before the first playoff game, not to ask for tactical input, but to ask how a person operated inside a system that had previously tried to destroy them without letting the awareness of that history distort every judgment they made going forward. Ethan thought about the question for a moment before answering. He said that the system does not need to be forgotten. It needs to be understood well enough that the person operating inside it can see the difference between a present-tense decision and a past-tense injury. He said that the 2 things would sometimes feel identical, and the work was in knowing the difference. Nolan said that was harder than it sounded. Ethan said that everything worth doing was harder than it sounded. The first home playoff game fell on a Saturday evening in January, and Marin came. She sat in the owner's section at Evelyn's invitation and watched the warm-ups from behind glass that looked down over the field level where the technical crew moved through their pregame checks. When Ethan's name appeared on the operational display board in the suite, not as a footnote, not as a historical correction, but as a current title attached to a current role, Marin read it twice. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she looked down at the tunnel entrance below and watched her father walk through the same passage where he had once been dragged away, this time with his credential accepted by a new security officer who opened the door and addressed him by his proper title without hesitation or ambivalence. Ethan crossed the sideline. The crowd in the stands was still filling in around them, movement and noise, and the gathering energy of 60,000 people preparing to watch something they cared about. He stood at the edge of the field and looked out across the grass and said nothing, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the space he was standing in was genuinely his. 11 years earlier, Ethan Rowe had been pulled off that field in the grip of men who were enforcing a lie. This time, when he walked through the same tunnel and onto the same grass, 60,000 people rose to their feet for the man who had never stopped protecting them.